Welcome to this session on ISO 222. I appreciate this is post-lunch and we're talking standard, which is often a boring topic. So we are going to try to make it lively so that you guys don't fall asleep. So today, effectively, our goal is mainly to help potential adopters and participants in Mojaloop-based payment hubs gaining a deeper understanding of ISO 222 impact and to hear valuable insight from experts in. Actually, if we look at this panel, we have a unique set of perspectives. Standard, the person who has been driven the introduction of new standard for Mojaloop, and Derek, who is an adopter and implementer of the standard for Mojaloop, right? So thank you very much for participating to this panel. So first, I'd like to short of understand the importance of ISO 222 migration for low-value inclusive payments, right? Obviously, this is a key decision criteria for adopters. So, Mike, I'd like to start with you with a fundamental question. So, if we look at ISO 222, it's a very rich but very complex standard to implement. Difficult to understand, difficult to have access to information, and so on, right? Through this journey, it's actually very easy to lose sight of the overall objective of why should we implement ISO 222. So could you please, let us know why ISO 222 is a migration is crucial for low value inclusive payments, and what are the key goals and what are the support available for hub operators moving towards ISO 222?
Okay, so picking up from what we were discussing this morning, kind of standards make the world go around, right? They give people a common language to speak. And it's important to think about them conveying the right data. So picking up exactly what Mike was talking about, carrying all the right data across things consistently, right? And although it's a complex standard, I guess you could say it's complex, there are ways to kind of deal with that. And I think in the end, rich data actually reduces the cost of transactions in the end because it helps to reduce the fails. Not every scheme or platform is going to be a Mojaloop one, which solves the problem. Surprise, surprise, because the world likes to be complex and do their own things in different ways. But at least if we can think about a standard that carries the right information in a consistent way with, standards around what's there, we get smooth settlement the majority of the time. Michael was quite right, that cost of remediation is extremely high. And the only way we can really address that is to make sure the right data comes. Now, I think when we talk about ISO 222 and the migration, it's in the path of our migration at the moment. We're moving from proprietary standards to open standards. And I'm going to talk a little bit later maybe about the complexity of open standards, because that's part of the problem that we're facing, and we have to get back to harmonization. In terms of things that can support the journey, though, as we move, and maybe I'll say as well, for migrations, the first step is adopt the standard. The second step is focus on the quality. And that's kind of another important point to think about, right? We're not at the end of the journey with the migrations that are happening to ISO 222. We're at the beginning of a journey to improve quality. But first, you need the foundations, the kind of, I don't know, the thing that can carry the data, right? In terms of the things that Swift specifically provides to kind of support it, we have a big portal called My Standards, which outlines all of the standards that are published, at least the central ones. Not everyone uses that, but that's okay. At least you can find the kind of baselines and what people are agreeing in that sense. And also Swift as a kind of standards convener, I don't know, registration authority, as somebody who looks after standards, also provides consultancy services around that to help people with their implementations as well, just to make sure that we're doing things right. And I think the other thing, maybe the last thing to say, standards is a community effort as well. It takes a community to get them right. It's not something that's dictated and prescribed. It needs to be something that everyone contributes to ultimately.
Thank you for this. And in fact, like we've been contributing as part of
Exactly.
the Mojaloop Foundation. In fact, like Michael, I'd like to ask you this question because like adopting the ISO 222 standard for the Mojaloop platform has been a journey which started like 2 or 3 years ago. I can't really remember. Could you perhaps like, brief, give us a brief overview of Mojaloop journey with ISO 222 payment standard evaluation group, and why the foundation prioritized this change and the impact for us?
Thank you. It is. Thank you. I'm afraid I can't, Julie, because we only have half an hour. Actually, the Mojaloop Foundation's engagement with ISO 20022 really dates back 10 years. We evaluated the ISO 20022 standard quite early on and decided that it wasn't suitable for inclusive instant payment systems. There were a number of reasons for that. At the time, we decided to go ahead with our own standard, the FSP IOP standard. However, even the Mojaloop Foundation could see which way the wind was blowing, and more people required compliance with ISO 20022 in order to implement their systems. So we took another look at it. Unfortunately, things hadn't got any better in the meantime. So we decided the only sensible way was to join the ISO 20022 organization ourselves and to try to add things to the standard and to change the standard so that it would be more appropriate to the sorts of things that we wanted to do. I have the honor to represent the Mojaloop Foundation on the ISO 20022 standards committees, which has been sometimes an interesting experience, sometimes a not so interesting experience. But gradually speaking, I think it's fair to say that the particular requirements of inclusive instant payment systems have got a hearing in the ISO 20022 world. We have changes to the existing payments messages, which are currently in process of being implemented. They'll be published as part of the standard in the next maintenance cycle, which will be next spring. And we are now working on the addition of new messages to cover the agreement of terms phase. So when I originally presented the things that we wanted to do, basically people said, why on earth would you want to do that? But now they're saying that isn't such a stupid thing to want to do. And they still don't necessarily completely get it, but they're on the way. So it's not that they were, how can I put this? Not that they wanted to ignore the sorts of things that instant payment systems, particularly inclusive ones, wanted to do. It's just that they didn't know about it. And nobody had explained to them why these things might be important. So we are now happily part of the community, but that doesn't mean that the ISO community doesn't need more people to help with this and to make sure. I've heard it said that the voice of Africa needs to be heard in the ISO 20022 organization. And I've had conversations recently with my good friend Robert Ochola from African Enda. You in the room, Robert? No, maybe not. But one of the things that African Enda is prepared to do is to sponsor a continental ISO 20022 initiative, whose objectives will be to arrive at a harmonized set of ISO 20022 requirements for jurisdictions across Africa. The eventual objective being that payment systems across the continent will be able to exchange messages with each other. So that's a very exciting initiative. Anyone who's interested in joining that, please come and see me, or indeed Robert, and we will get this thing going.
Thank you for this. And yeah, I attend some of this call. It was quite funny to be asked over and over the same question around why can't you use this specific message format? Derek, I'd like to turn to you now, like as obviously someone who has implemented Mojaloop and has decided to go down the ISO 222 routes. So what were the reasons that motivate your decision, and what advice would you offer to those considering adoption of ISO 222?
Part of the reason we, as IPSL, decided to adopt the ISO 20022 standard was our initial switch was a card payment switch, and it was using an ISO 8583 standard. And when we tried to adopt it to perform or to do instant payments, there was some performance limitation adopting it to do that. One of the limitations was we could only handle 0 to 100 participants that could be configured on that particular switch. Secondly, we had a success rate of 86%. We needed to increase this to an acceptable level. We also needed to enhance the experience for P2P, account-to-account customers. Essentially, we needed to provide our way to do account lookup, and I know before you initiate or send money across the ecosystem, you know who the direct customer's name before you sending the money, so that to limit a number of wrong accounts receiving funds that weren't intended for them. When we adopted ISO 222, one of the things we noted is we jumped from 86 or 85% to today 98% success rate. We have a 99.99 uptime based on where we were. Currently, we have the entire ecosystem that we are managing. Only one participant is pending to migrate to the ISO 222, and we believe by the end of or the beginning of Q1 next year, we'll have all the participants on that standard. Your second question was about what I would like to inform anyone who wants to adopt the ISO 2022 standard. One of the things we took from this is a very costly exercise. It requires the correct investment in, especially in the right technical expertise to implement this. Secondly, one of the issues that were raised were the small banks was they were afraid that the big banks, because of the technical expertise or being a large organization, would take up their client base based on this particular migration. Thirdly, you need to look at what capacity requirements you have. We had, in that particular time, looked at where we would want to be, and we knew our current switch could not be able to provide that capability. And when we adopted these standards, we've been able to see the fruits of that particular piece of work. I think that's what I would like to say about those two items.
Thank you. I'm going to go off script a bit. Sorry, guys. I know you can manage it probably. Because I want to echo a bit what you just mentioned around small banks. And in fact, Mike, I'd like to turn to you regarding this, because we know this is a challenge for many small banks to get access to the information, because often they are excluded from the closed user group, or get the right expertise as well, right? At Swift, these smaller institutions are called long tail, and I'm terrible at defining terms, so perhaps you can help me on this. So how would you support the long tail or smaller banks institution to migrate to the standard?
Start with the long tail. So long tail for us is, I think, about the top 175 banks, financial institutions in the world send more than 80%, I think, something like that, of transactions across. So the long tail is that last set that have much smaller volumes, may not have the level of automation that the bigger banks do, but still have to comply with those same standards in the same way. And they need more support because it's a tougher standard. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about high value here. I know we're talking about instant, but let's start from that a little bit, right? And I want to quickly share a few lessons from like the history of Swift, right? So I mentioned earlier this morning that we're 50 years old, and we started the standards journey by Swift dictating a standard. We called it MT, developed in the 70s, and it was quite light, and it took account of using very thin lines and very little data, that we could transmit. So we squashed things into very tight spaces. And we had a proprietary network as well. So to use Swift, you had to go across proprietary network with this MT standard. And if you didn't, you couldn't join or be part of it. And I think that realization eventually was, this doesn't work. It doesn't make sense from a resilience perspective to have everyone forced down kind of a single channel. So to achieve true interoperability and openness, we have to move to an open standard, right? That's why ISO 20022. And in 2019, our community voted and asked Swift, could you please help us move to a new standard en masse? So all of the RTGSs, there are about 79, 80 RTGSs globally that run on the Swift network. Could you please help us with migration? And Swift also committed to, over a 3 or 4 year period, entering November 2025, to move all the cross-border payments, specifically the cross-border payment messaging between banks, so the bit between the domestic bits, to ISO 20022 as an open standard. The problem with open standards is they're open. And so what happened was, as market infrastructures decided, they said, well, we can do whatever we like with this open standard. We'll implement our own versions. And so they started to build their own versions of the standard and implement it. And it was only when they got to moving their market infrastructures across to those standards and then going cross-border that they realized the incompatibilities that they created by trying to be clever and solve for a domestic market or for a regional market. If we look at Europe, did exactly that, right? And now that's kind of made people realize the importance of agreeing standards on a global basis, because they shouldn't be, they're not something that set you apart or make you better than anyone else or anything like that. And so, the real realization was that non-standard standards are hard and extremely expensive when it comes to interoperability or crossing borders. So that was a huge lesson learned, and I'm going to come back to why this matters, right? So I want to say, please learn the lesson from the high-value payment space where people thought open standards meant they could do what they wanted and be a little bit different. That doesn't work. Now we have what we call the high-value payment plus working group, which is working on bringing standards and bringing all of the, honestly, it's the big countries that went off the scheme, off the rails a little bit and did their own thing. What Swift's done, and I'm going to use the kind of example from the high value space. Swift realized that actually to get the long tail, to get the smaller RTGSs onto a standardized and harmonized version of ISO 20022, we built something called the ISO Accelerator Pack, which enabled RTGSs to adopt a standardized, harmonized version of ISO 20022 that was aligned with HVPS Plus and CBPR Plus, the cross-border standard. And that gets kind of rolled out with network validation and a whole lot of other benefits as well as a single package. And then we maintain that and upgrade it. In fact, it's provided free of charge for those RTGSs as well.
Free of charge for RTGSs,
Yes.
but what about like instant payment?
So, as I say, our focus up to now has been on that space. Instant payment systems, about 68% of instant payment systems, I believe, are running on ISO 20022. I did some digging into those figures, and that's not really fair because all of the countries in Europe are counted in that. So actually, it's because of the SEPA scheme, it sounds really, really good. The reality is that actually we have a lot of differences out there. And when you look at Project Nexus as well, they went and looked at all of the ISO implementations because all 5 of the people involved there in the original kind of phase 3 had ISO, but none of them were standardized or harmonized. So they actually had struggles even agreeing how to come together. I think what we could be thinking about, though, and maybe it's something that we take away from this convening, is to look at what can we do, maybe as Swift, to help with the instant payment side, and maybe a little bit later on we'll talk about IP Plus, and that's probably where we get to helping solve it for the long tail.
So it's interesting, right? Like what you're basically saying is like the standards are not standardized enough. And in reality, there are like various flavors of the standard, right? In fact, I think like, as soon as like you touch different market infrastructure, you face this challenge. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, like, both of you, Derek, as like, an adopter of ISO, and also like, Michael as trying to move the standard along, like being part of the payment evaluation group. Is it a problem that you're discussing within the group?
Well, I think, and Mike said, the ISO 20022 standard is a complicated one. And it's complicated because their response to a new request, and this is what they did with our request, is to say, sure, we'll add it. And that means that ISO messages, even the most commonly used ones, have very large amounts of optional elements in them. Now, individual payment systems, interoperable systems, and indeed individual connections between banks may not need to use very large parts of the available standard. The problem comes when you start to say, well, what sorts of things are we going to insist on, and what sorts of things are we going to say, well, you can put that in if you like, but we're going to ignore it, or what sort of things are we going to say, if you send us something like that, we will reject it. Now, that's a significant problem, and it's resulted, I think, in two varieties of what I would call rogue ISO. So one of the things that the ISO organization allows people to do is to write what's called a market practice document. And a market practice document says, out of all of the things in the ISO standard, we are going to use these things, we are going to mandate that these things must be present, we're not going to allow these things. And any scheme can write a document like that. They don't have to have it approved by the ISO organization. They don't even have to register it with the ISO organization. So they can just go ahead and more or less do what they want. The other thing that's happened, another way of going rogue ISO, is people will download the schemas for the ISO documents and they will just change them. I mean, they're just XML schemas. Anybody who knows XML can add things to it, take things out of it, all of those sorts of things. So we have certainly come across people who say, yes, we're using ISO 20022. And when we say, oh yeah, what kind is that? And they say, well, we downloaded the document and we put these things and those things and that, And obviously those sorts of messages simply won't be comprehensible to anyone other than the operator of the scheme that's doing it. But as Mike said, they still say, yeah, ISO 20022, we're doing it.
So Derek, I'd like to get your perspective on this, and especially like earlier you mentioned about the cost of the migration, right? How much of this cost is coming from actually potential, variants of ISO and having different flavor?
We have, just to show the magnitude of this, we have an internal joke, especially when we are onboarding new participants. We usually have to send an onboarding pack that is 20, 30 or so documents, very large document that details how to implement this ISO 2022. And the challenges being discussed by the panel of implementing this what we see on a day-to-day basis. When engaging these banks and participants or DFSPs, it takes them a very long time for them to implement this. And even when they do, there's some things that are missed. So agreeing to Michael's point that, yes, we could say some have implemented these standards, but not maybe in the correct way. So there are challenges to it. There's a very deep learning curve to implement this. But also to Mike's point is you have to start somewhere. And we've chosen to start somewhere. And there are things we're trying to do to make it, to take everyone along the journey.
Thank you. Moving on from challenges and more like from the benefits of the migration. So you mentioned already, Derek, like, in terms of success rate of payments, that it had a significant impact. Actually, Michael, I'd like to turn to you because this morning we saw through the COMESA presentation that they are adopting ISO 222 as part of basically the features of Interscheme, right? Could you perhaps explain a bit more how like the adoption of ISO for the Interscheme score solution has been central? And perhaps like, can we have the slide on the screen?
That's the slide.
Slide.
Okay. Yeah. So we talk about ISO 20022 messages, and at the moment, that's what they are. The way the ISO standard is structured is that at the bottom level is a data dictionary, and the data dictionary is structured in an implementation independent way. There is then a converter which will take a definition from the data dictionary and produce an XML schema which represents that message as it's defined in the data dictionary. At the moment, that's the only form of implementation that ISO has. We are currently working on two things. First of all, a version that will produce a JSON message from the same dictionary definition. And second of all, something that will provide standards for putting those JSON structures into an actual API. Oh, there we are, API definition. We had to do this ourselves. We had the endpoints, which you can see on the slide there. We had for each endpoint to say which ISO message do we think is appropriate for that endpoint. Some of them you will see are standard ISO messages, but there are also new ISO messages, number 2 and number 3, for instance, which are not yet in the ISO standard. We spoke to the ISO organization and explained to them what we wanted to do with COMESA, and they said, great. It's very good that you will be able to test out your ideas in a real implementation before the standard, and anything that needs to change as a consequence of that, we can put into the standard. So what we've had to do is we have manually converted the existing XML message documents, first of all, into JSON, and second of all, into the payloads of API definitions. We have some tools that helped us to do that, but actually a great deal of this stuff was handcrafted, and we expect that in the long run, we will wind up having ISO organizational tools that will enable conversion between these things. So it's we're at the beginning of a journey here, and we're having to do most of this ourselves. Eventually, we hope there will be support from the ISO organization, or possibly from philanthropic organizations like Swift, that will make this whole process very much easier. Even if we can do this easily, we still have to consider what happens if an institution which uses ISO messages wants to interact with an institution which is using an API, and how the conversions between those two things will work. So watch this space.
Thank you for this. And I think like echoing a bit like two things that you both said around we are at the beginning of this journey, right? And I think like one of the key words in the beginning of the convening has been interoperability. interoperability within, like, the various market infrastructure in Africa, but beyond. And as Mike, you said it, we are at the beginning of the ISO 20022 journey. Many market infrastructure beyond Africa have migrated to ISO 222 and are now mandating new data feeds, right? Like, for example, category purpose. So the question is, how do you make sure that when you initiate a payment in one market infrastructure, that you know about, like, this data requirement and the money can flow seamlessly to the other market infrastructure?
Okay, Mike's 5-point plan for how to do this. So the first one, and Michael mentioned it, first one is publish, make available on your market practice guidelines. That's critical. Share them beyond that. There's so many scheme owners globally who choose not to share what they do domestically, but that doesn't make any sense for markets that are trying to initiate a payment into that market. If you don't know what the rules for where you're trying to reach, it's going to fail, or people are going to learn the hard way. So I think that's the one. The second one is to update directories. So again, for scheme owners, regulators, to update the directory services that exist, Swift as SwiftRef, for instance, to update those with all of the details of what's needed for your specific market as well, because then it can be exposed to anyone initiating a payment as well. The third thing is to share data with pre-validation service providers. That there are many. Swift, of course, provides, but there are a number out there. To actively share data that helps say, this is unique to my market. This is how I choose to do things in my market, which is fine. There's always going to be differences, but publish it, update those directories, and share it with pre-validation. Fourth one, tracking and update tracking services, because when things go wrong, you want to be able to correct them. And that helps you get that learning cycle quickly. If you can quickly see it's always failing here, even it's always failing with this bank or this institution, there's a conversation to be had, right? So data creates the ability to have that discussion. And then the last one is to proactively align with market practice standards and market practice. And here, I'm going to talk about IP+, right? So I've been keeping this for the end, and I think I have a little slide. Maybe I'll get the clicker. Okay, so Michael set me up very nicely for this. I'm gonna stand here and run through this. Remember, Michael said that there's this data dictionary, which is brilliant. Okay, so everything starts from the data dictionary, and then you have this massive universe of things that most people won't use, like Michael said, of a kind of ISO 20022 base message. And then we have a number of guidelines, so cut down versions. So we take a portion of everything that's in that entire universe, and we define a kind of a usage guideline around it. So we have a CBPR plus usage guideline. This is specifically used for cross-border payments. And then there's the one I mentioned earlier called HVPS plus, which is used for high-value payment systems, right? These are the things that are implemented domestically in markets. So your RTGS platforms moving to ISO 20022. Now, there are different things. You might say, why don't these all overlap? Well, a cross-border transaction that's going between the two banks doesn't need the same kind of data of something that's going through a domestic clearing system. So domestic clearing identifies. There are natural differences for why, but we're really interested in what crosses over. Okay, what we're working on now is IP+. And IP+ is going to be a cut-down version, if you like, of HVPS+, with all of the elements removed that could make it not STP, right? So we want to get to a subset, the smallest possible subset of elements in that message that will allow seamless cross-border domestic transactions and cross-border transactions, because it will be fully aligned with CBPR+. And so the idea here, if we get this right with IP+, is to have a standard that everyone can use and adopt in their domestic instant payment systems that provides for seamless domestic transactions. This is the way we simplify the adoption process, by building those market practice standards and then adopting them as an industry. That's the idea. So IP+, good news is CPMI, working with Swift, are about to make a call for people to come and contribute to this community effort, to that IP+ working group. And like Michael's call earlier, I'm going to call for people to kind of come forward and contribute and become part of that working group as well, because that's the way we bring standards and harmonization back into instant payment systems on a global basis.
So direct like extra work for you, right?
No, I was just saying, include me.
You're included.
Thank you.
And I guess like I know we are over time, but I'd like to give the last word of this session to you as an adopter and understand like, yeah, what are you feel when you see things like FP Plus and what is your roadmap for ISO 222? Very briefly, since we're already over time.
From where I sit or where we sit, where we are looking at the roadmap for ISO 20022, and also looking at where we sit within our ecosystem. Our current focus right now is one, our current utilization isn't over switch, is limited based on what we think we can do. We haven't even hit a good usage that we would want, and our focus will be trying to drive utilization of our switch based on the standards we have provided. The second aspect of it, as the panel has said, is ISO 20022 provides very data-rich information, which we haven't been able to leverage, be able to use that, even provide customer segregated customer insights, maybe do some promotions around maybe gender, some promotion around age. The last thing that we're looking forward to is work with the community, and I'm looking at what Mike has presented in front, and are working towards to building something that is shared across not just our ecosystem, but different jurisdictions, and being part of that.
Thank you very much. Well, we don't have time for questions because we are really, really over time, but these three gentlemen are going to be around. So if you have any question for them, please feel free to engage with them during the break. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.